Hey, what's up, everyone? Charles and Captain L here, and we are going to be discussing DSR. So, in terms of just the rule sets in general, we've been having a lot of rule set content. I think educating the general community about rule sets in general is a very good idea. And we have two sides of the coin when it comes to DSR. I'm very against DSR, and Captain L is very for DSR. And I think that's completely fine. And I think we just want to have an argument and kind of discuss the pros and the cons of each side and have you guys be able to listen in on it. And we'll start off with going over the DSR rule set, but before, or just what DSR is, but before we do that, just a quick introduction of Captain L. Go for it.
Sure, yeah, I'm Captain L. I've been competing since I want to say about 2010 was when I went to my first offline tournament, so that was a brawl tournament. Um, I don't have a whole ton of experience TOing. Like I run a couple of really small brawl tournaments, but I think as anyone who was around for that time knows, it's a much different experience TOing like 20 guys just meeting in the back of a store as opposed to the majors that go on today. So from rule set perspectives, I definitely approach it as much more of a competitor. I was ranked in the PGR a couple times in Smash 4, and I was 50th on the very first Ultimate ranking, so those are my credentials as a competitor. But these days, I mostly compete in region, which is in the Pacific Northwest. I'm from Vancouver, so just like the Vancouver guys, the Washington scene and the Oregon scene are like mostly where I'm competing these days.
And I want to add also one of, if not the best lab rat, in my opinion, for the game. I think Captain L is a phenomenal person when it comes to studying the game. And you can also check out Captain L's content on YouTube, especially made a lot of content at the beginning of Ultimate with like some of the task movement and stuff like that. So when it comes to understanding like base mechanics of the game, I feel like you're one of the best, if not the best, when it comes to that. So definitely want to give you your flowers for that.
Yeah, I didn't want to plug myself and be like, oh, I'm so smart. Everyone should know how smart I am. But thanks for doing that for me.
Yes, yes, definitely a lot of respect there. And also, you came down to a QuakeCon, the one of the first Ultimate
Oh.
ones. Yeah, so that was we had a good time down there. So that was a good time.
hmm
So now we can get into DSR. DSR stands for Dave's Stupid Rule, and it's something. Now, me and Cam Noah were actually talking about this. We don't know how much it was used in Brawl, but it was used very heavily in Smash 4. In Brawl, it was a lot of like the Wild Wild West. We had things like Rainbow Cruise and stuff like that legal, so we had to go through the whole like kind of defining what kind of skill checks we wanted to have as a community. Like, do you want how do we want to reward people for being good on Rainbow Cruise or Delfino, some of these walk-off stages, right? So very, very Wild West stuff. Maybe some regions use DSR in Brawl, but didn't. But we don't know. We don't really have a lot of history of that. And I should explain the actual rule itself. So Dave's stupid rule is when you win on a stage, you cannot counterpick back to that stage. So if me and Captain L played a set and he won game one on PS2, say I win game two, and then on game three, Captain L has to counterpick. I can throw out my bans, but also when I am throwing out my bans, I need to also realize that like, oh hey, he cannot go back to PS2 unless I agree to it, right? So that is base DSR. And do you want to go ahead and explain modified DSR?
Yeah, sure. So modified DSR. I also want to say a bit of a terminology thing. I'm probably
Hmm.
going to keep calling it DSR and MDSR for this chat, but
Yeah.
I think that for a while there was a shift where we wanted to start calling it stage clause and modified stage clause. I think that makes it sound a lot more better, a lot more official. But
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point.
yeah, that small nitpick there. Modified DSR or modified stage clause is basically just the last stage that you've won on. You can't counterpick back to that. And so in a best of three, that makes no difference at all because there's only ever going to be one person who's affected by the rule. In a best of five, it does honestly open up some kind of unintended situations where if like the same person wins game one and two, then all of a sudden they're locked out of picking their opponent's counterpick, which they probably didn't want to pick anyway. So I think Charles, you and I probably agree that modified DSR, it was a bit of a compromise that was made for smaller rule sets, and it probably doesn't really need to exist anymore. And I think that a lot of TOs are kind of realizing that modified DSR is just the worst possible compromise.
Yeah, yeah, and it also just adds more layers of complication where it's just like, oh, like, are we playing with regular DSR, modified DSR for players and stuff like that? So it also kind of made a coin flip for those who haven't competed in Smash 4. We did not have the hazards off toggle, so we had a very limited stage list. sometimes looking back on it, I wish we didn't have the hazards off toggle because it would be so much easier to make a stage list in this game if we just didn't have the options, as weird as that sounds. So in Smash 4, in the beginning, we had a much larger stage list. There was, I mean, Duck Hunt obviously was the stage that like shouldn't have been on there that we eventually got rid of because of how defensive the stage was. And I can't really think of it. I know Dreamland was like had some controversy around it, but ended up staying with Battlefield, which I thought was dumb because having two triplats like was not good. But we just didn't have that much big of a stage list. I think it ended up the unified stage list for Smash 4 was like 6 stages, or was it 7?
It was 6 stages,
Right.
and Battlefield and Dreamland were tied, which I agree with you. I think that was kind of a silly compromise. I think that 5 stages is a perfectly good rule set, and we definitely could have just run with that. Honestly, I've actually been like looking into sort of reviving the Smash 4 scene, at least in my region, and going back and seeing how limited the stage variety is in that game. I'm just really like, wow, we didn't have a better option than Lylat, unless we really only want to run like the.
Lylat was the other stage. There we go.
Lylat was another stage. Unless we really want to just run like the Brawl Japan stage list, where it was just like Battlefield, Smashville, and FD, and so it's. We are very fortunate in Ultimate now to have at least so many stages that these sorts of discussions actually matter, because it's not just like making the best out of a bad situation. It truly is taking like all of the resources that the game gives us and trying to like make a good competitive experience.
Right, which is why I think it's so hard to even, have a unified stage list at the start. I mean, obviously we're trying to do that right now, along with everyone in the Lumi rankings Discord, where we've kind of got like all the TOs, and there's like a barrier in a sense of like, okay, TOs of a B plus tier or higher can be a part of it and have a vote and yada yada. So we're trying to set up the system, and I think that's what has sparked a lot of these discussions. And before we even go any further, this is something I'm very guilty of that I'm actually trying to work on. But whenever you have like these arguments or discussions, I personally come off as like very aggressive, and that's something that I'm trying to work on. Like whenever you guys discuss this with your peers or TOs or anything like that, just keep in mind that you're trying to debate for the overall like good of the community and stuff like that, right? Like we're trying to come to a compromise where it's like, okay, when do we start losing competitive integrity? When do we start like catering to newer players? And there's so much things that we're trying to balance, and we don't have the developer coming in and being like, this is competitive Smash Brothers, like 3 stocks or 2 stocks at this timer. Like there's so many different things that we as a community have to decide, like where do we want the skill to be implemented from these rule sets. And obviously the rule set it's going to be the backbone, right? The stock count, the timer, the stages, stage clauses like DSR and stuff like that. These all come into play, right? So now coming back to the topic itself, Smash 4, we had a limited stage list, so that's why we have to kind of move more towards modified DSR, especially going into those best of 5s. Now that we have a bigger stage list, or you can have a limited stage list, but we have more options, right? So we can have bigger stage lists. Even the Europe Unified rule set has 9 stages. That's quite a bit. When we start dipping into that 9 area, you gotta start bringing in the whack stages like Yoshi's, right? And stuff like that. So I know a lot of players aren't too fond of that stage, but yeah, so, and then even kind of going into Melee a little bit, right? Melee has full DSR, both best of 3 and best of 5. The only thing that's a difference is you get a ban in a best of 3 and you do not get a ban in best of 5, which is why you have to eat that Marth FD counter pick no matter what in Melee. And I know PNW is a region that feels very, very strongly about the stage claw DSR. So why don't you go into that and like why you guys feel like DSR is such an important part of the competitive scene?
Yeah. So I guess this is kind of a good segue into more or less the main reason that I wanted to have this chat with you was I think that in the original rule set discussion video, DSR was kind of just brushed off as, oh, it's just stage variety for the sake of stage variety, but that's not actually that important. So I kind of wanted to like give a better picture of why we think that that is more of a important aspect to have in a rule set. And it pretty much comes down to like the philosophy of what you see the role of stages in a set is. So if you're going to run no DSR, you're more likely to get people going back to the same stages. And in that sense, I think that stages kind of just function philosophically at least, as just a matchup slider, sort of. So let's say you have 9 stages or whatever. Player 1 is good on stages like ABC. Player 2 is good on like XYZ, and then ideally you would want to have like LMN as the 3 stages that you play the set on, because it's going to be like the most consistent, the most close to a true representation of what the matchup should be. And in that sense, like you're just eliminating as many outside factors as possible and really getting to who is the better player in these controlled conditions. And that's totally fine, actually. I fully respect that, and I think that it is a good, logically consistent rule set that I'm perfectly happy as a competitor to play on. Now, when I'm putting on like my sort of TO, sort of rule maker hat, I actually see stages a little bit differently. And I think that a stage is truly like an opportunity for skill expression within a set, where that might also totally be colored by the characters that I play, because Sheik and Pikachu and Pichu are pretty much the 3 characters that I've had the most experience with in tournament in my career, and I think that all 3 of those characters play like wildly differently on pretty much every single stage. Like the amount of skill expression that I see when I watch like Shiny Mark playing on like Battlefield or something, I'm like, man, he does completely different combos than like a lot of other Pikachus that I've seen, and it turns what is like historically seen as like not a great stage for Pikachu into like one of his really really good stages that he's really strong on. And I think that being able to see that kind of expression and like that need to actually adapt and like make your character work on these stages that they might like historically not be seen good on. I think that that's like a really important skill, and I do think that that's something that we want the rule set to test. And if you are going to have a rule set that has no DSR, you're really heavily incentivized to just, especially with usually when you have no DSR, you would throw in an extra ban, right? That's pretty much how every rule set does it. So you'll get that extra ban, and you'll just be like, well, I'm pretty much never going to have to play on like Battlefield, small Battlefield, and whatever other stage you don't like if you're that kind of character. And so you can more or less just like never really have to learn how to play those stages, and just like only ever play on like the more neutralish ones. And maybe once in a while your opponent will like forget to ban something that you're really good on, and so you can go there. But it really does allow you to restrict what you're good at playing on. And again, I think that there's a lot of skill expression in being able to pilot your character effectively on like a wide variety of stages. So that's why when I like designing a rule set, I kind of want to think, okay, we have 5 games. If you need to win 3 games to win a set, I think that you should have to be able to win on at least 3 out of the 5 or 7 or 9 or whatever stages that we deem fit for competition. Because like again, by including these stages in the rule set, having a rule set that has 7 stages, we're saying that all 7 of these stages are like valid competition spots where we think that being a better player on these stages is like a reasonable skill that we want to test. So I think that it makes like logical sense to say if you want to be the winner of a set, you should have to be able to win on more than like just 1 or 2 of those stages. And I'm also I keep going with 3 because I do think that best of 5 is the format that we should be kind of striving to emulate. And if we had like all the time in the world for a tournament to run, I think no one would argue that best of 5 the entire way through is probably the way to go. The only reason that we really have to run a best of 3 is because it's just a concession for time. Otherwise, you would have like a lot of sets taking way longer than they really have to in order to figure out who's the better player. So that's also kind of why we changed the number of bans, because that way it makes a best of 3 much more closely mimic a best of 5, where if you consider like the person's first counter pick to whatever their strongest stage in the matchup is, like again, I keep saying that a stage is like an opportunity for skill expression. So it sucks that we kind of have to just consider them in a best of 3 as though you would get like an auto win on that stage and just move on to what I would see as like the games 4 and 5. So that's why we changed the number of bans in a best of 3, because rather than thinking of it as playing like games 1, 2, and 3 out of a best of 5, I'd rather think of it as playing games 1, 4, and 5 out of the best of 5. And so that makes it kind of closer to mimicking the best of 5 experience. But again, I think that a rule set in general should strive to make the best of 5 experience possible, and then try to mimic that as closely as possible for a best of 3.
Right. And I think the core of the argument for DSR is you feel that being able to play and win on different stages is a huge part of the skill expression of Smash in itself, right? Because
Yes.
when I think, and I even had a discussion with Fallen, a Smash 4 veteran, Rosalina player, PGR'd multiple times, many times. And so when I talked with Fallen, it's like, it's interesting because when you think of even just the counter pick stage rule, where it's like, okay, these group of stages are a counter pick, right? And when the reason why we play best of 3, best of 5 sets in Smash or in practically any fighting game is we want to have a larger sample size, right? Like if, me and Captain L play just the best of 1, we would probably get more consistent results if we played like a first to 3 or a first to 5 or a first to 10, right? Like the bigger the sample size. Now, obviously, there's time restraints in a tournament, right? So not every set can be a first to 10 because, like, obviously you would get the best results or more consistent results from that, but we have a limited timer. So usually best of 3, best of 5 territory. I like to think of top level Smash of best of 5 just because when you get to a certain part of the bracket, usually that top 128, top 64, it switches over to best of 5. And there's even tournaments that now do best of 5 for every single set because they kind of allotted the time for that, right? Now, if we wanted, my thing with just general sample size is the first match is so different from the rest of the set. The very first match is struck to a neutral stage, right? So if technically we want it to be bland and throw the concept out of like, oh, hey, like the stage, being able to win on different stages is skill expression, which I agree with. I do agree with that statement. But if we wanted a sample size to be the exact same from game 1 to game 5, right, we could just have the striking rule, the way we strike for the first set. Now, that is the extreme opposite of DSR. That is like, obviously not having DSR is the opposite of DSR, but having a stage strike for every single game is like even more opposite of DSR because that it is very likely you pay 1 map or maybe 2. Like it kind of depends. Maybe there would be a meta developed around it or what have you, right? You could start striking the neutral stages to start forcing like weirder stages and stuff like that. But essentially the same way you pick the stage would be from game 1. And technically that would be the most accurate sample size from game to game. Like every single game, the stage is picked the same way. And then the only thing is different is you counterpick characters first, then you strike stage, or however you wanted the order to be, right? Like there'd be some sort of character counterpicking, but then the stage counterpicking would be way more on a neutral stance because it's just striking, right? So that's the exact opposite, and I don't want that. I do think that having like some kind of, I don't agree with counterpick stages, but I do agree with just the concept of, okay, you take out X amount of stages and then I will counterpick to a stage, right? Whether it, is a comfort stage of mine. And, there are a lot of characters that, this is just factual. Characters do play different on different stages, right? Even platform heights. Small Battlefield is different from PS2, right? Are they pretty similar in the fact that they have 2 platforms? Yes, but Small Battlefield has like lower platforms. Like Fox can up smash characters on a Small Battlefield platform rather than a PS2 platform. So if Fox is tech chasing you on Small Battlefield, you can die at like 80% by getting up smashed if he reads correctly, right? As to where PS2, that option is not available unless Fox gets on the platform. There's a bunch of these small little nuances and knowledge checks that apply to all of these different stages, right? Now, for my side of the argument for getting rid of stage clauses is I think that it adds a layer of complication to the rule set, right? So even for counterpick, do I want counterpick stages? Like I don't think counterpicks are that big of a deal because usually counterpick stages are going to get struck out anyway. And if you don't strike a counterpick stage, that's like on the player. I don't think we need to hold the player's hand and be like, yeah, you should probably strike FD or Kalos, right? Like, well, to me, it's like I would never want to start game 1 on FD or Kalos, so just strike it, right? So to me, that part doesn't make sense, but I'm just using it as an example of like, I would rather just take counterpick stages out because I feel like it adds a layer of complication that is not necessary. And for me, the way I view Smash, I view it in a very macro sense where it's like, my first priority is competitive integrity. No matter what I'm thinking about, competitive integrity is number 1. But I will sack little bits of competitiveness, or like, I wouldn't call it competitive integrity, but I will call it competitive integrity because that is like a skill check, right? So I will sack a little bit of competitive integrity to gain a lot of accessibility, right? Because for me, again, I think of Smash in a macro sense where it's like, I want the community to get bigger. I want viewership to get bigger because I want this to be a sustainable esport where someone can go full time in it. And in my dream world, I want there to be college leagues, high school leagues, and I want someone to be able to I want to pursue Smash, but I don't have to be top 10 in the world to make a living off of Smash, right? I want there to be an ecosystem for Smash that is sustainable and has a lot more opportunities for people outside of being like top 10 players or like a top 5 commentator or what have you, right? Like you can make it in Smash, but you have to be in that like top 1 or top like half of 1% to make a sustainable living or a content creator, right? So trying to expand that ecosystem is my general goal. So for me, my perspective is like I will sack that little bit of competitive integrity. Maybe sets, or no, for sure sets will be played on less stages overall, right? Because that stage claw DSR forces players, no matter what, it forces them, unless they gentlemen, right? We've seen some sets just gentlemen across the stage, like across the whole set to PS2 or whatever. So they can gentlemen to it, but most of the time you see at least 3 stages, right? At the very minimum, 3 stages will get played in a best of 5 set with that stage clause. So I feel like I'm willing to sack that competitive integrity by like 1 or 1.5 stages where it's like, oh, okay, now sets are going to be more like 2-to-1 stages throughout the whole set, which is less skill expression, but it makes the entry a little bit easier, right? So when a player comes, like my ideal rule set is a player comes in and they're learning Smash. And they're like, okay, cool, this is really sick. Like I'm learning Smash. Okay, so I go to my first tournament, and if one thing I want to, I mean, not necessarily be a rule, but I really love tournaments that do this, where they have the rule set printed out on a piece of paper in front of every setup, because again, rule sets are just very ever changing. We have so much options. Some people have stage clauses. Some people have, different stages. Some people have this stage as a counter pick. Like I saw one Japan rule set that had PS2 as a counter pick stage. So, there's a lot of different opinions on like what should be, what shouldn't be, what should even be part of the rule set, what should this stage fall in under, like this kind of stage or starter stage or what have you, right? So one, just having your rule set printed out in front of all the setups so it's very clear what the rule set is, I think should just be a general standard, and I love tournaments that do that. Also, I saw this in the Lumi Discord. Another standard that should be upheld is there should be a time period where the rule set gets locked in and cannot be changed. I know there's been some talk about on Twitter about that, and I just think it's generally messed up if someone pays for a flight and registration and then like 1 month prior or 2 months prior or something like that. There just has to be a certain threshold where like the rule set gets changed, and like is it the end of the world? Not really. Like you're probably still gonna go, you're probably still gonna play, but changing something so fundamental to the tournament, I think that concept should not be allowed, or we should definitely have some type of standard where it's like, oh, okay, like once it's 2 months out, the TO is not allowed to change the rule set, or it's like it's a suggested thing, right? Like the TO might be able to change it for like some last minute thing, but it should be like somewhat justified for the change, right? So I think those are just like base things that can help a lot of competitors and TOs get along more in general. But yeah, I just feel like when a player first comes in and like say that paper is not in front of them, and I'm pretty sure we've both been in this situation many times where you're explaining the rule set to a newer player, and by the time I start talking about DSR, the newer player does not give a flying fuck, because I'm probably like just beating them anyway because I'm much more experienced than them, right? But that's not the point. Like most of them don't give a fuck because or at least I feel like this. I'm not speaking for the new player or whatever, but most of them kind of get over it by the time I'm like in my third sentence explaining the rule set, and they're like, is it cool if I go here? And I'll just kind of be like, yeah, sure, let's go there, right? So to me, I've had those experiences where I feel like there's some kind of disconnect with newer players coming in, and they feel it, or I'm assuming that they feel like the rule set is too complex, and I just want it to be a lot more simple, where it's like, hey, we have 7 stages, you have this much bands, boom, and then we go. So I value that simplicity a lot, because I feel like it will open up the barrier. I'm assuming. Now, this is just an assumption, right? So I'm assuming it'll open up the barrier of entry. Have I had people come up to me and say, I quit Smash because the rule set is too complicated and I'm just fucking out because I don't know what the fuck those 3 letters mean and I'm out? That has never happened. Again, this is just an assumption, and I'm trying to open up the skill barrier. And I feel like the little bit of sacrifice to competitive integrity is worth it. So that's essentially my side. But I know PNW is definitely a region that stands by that they are for DSR, and they're very strong. Like they're very passionate about that opinion.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the amount of passion varies from player to player, and I will even like willingly admit there are people who I've talked to who are like they would say that they're like pretty passionate about DSR. They're like, yeah, I can't believe that I went to this tournament and didn't have DSR. That was so stupid. But then I kind of talk to them about why they prefer DSR, and they can't really articulate it. They're just like, well, no, isn't like no DSR bad? And so. For me, at least, I would rather people be like, if you're going to have a strong opinion, at least be informed about it. Which is why, when I'm competing, I try to just like take my strong opinions completely out of it. I'm like, okay, I'm going to this tournament. It's like on the East Coast or whatever. So there's like 3 bans, no DSR. That's what I'm playing now. I'm not going to think, wow, this is stupid. I can't believe I go to like PS2 every single game. I'm just going to like that is now the game that I'm playing. And that's kind of how I view rule sets like as a whole. It's like Smash Brothers is like a massive game with like thousands and thousands of different ways to play it, and we're trying to like put on like a little piece of paper in like 5 sentences or less how we think the better player can be determined, and that's really hard to say. And like 2 different rule sets determine the better player in a slightly different way, so it really is like a different game that you're playing if you go to a different region with a different rule set. So I fully agree with you in the sense that like a tournament should have to lock in its rule set at least like a month or 2 out before it goes live, and I think that that's like very, very reasonable for like the Lumi rank to kind of implement as a forced policy, where it's like, okay, if you're going to change the rule set like within 2 weeks or something of the tournament being announced, it's not eligible anymore. At the very least, I think that TOs would see that and be like, oh, I need to just lock in the rule set earlier as opposed to like procrastinating it. So fully agree with you on that one. I also pretty much agree with you on like getting rid of the delineation between like starters and counterpick stages. I think that just having like 7 stages or 9 stages or 5 stages or whatever and saying these are the stages, that's totally fine. And I think that that also like makes much more like logically consistent, because we're saying these stages are fit for competition. If you win on this stage, you're a better player. Like a win doesn't count as like only half a win if you win on a counterpick stage, right? So we're saying the stages are like equal in terms of whether or not you win on them matters. So why are we like separating them at the start of the game by saying, oh yeah, for game 1 it has to be one of these 5 stages, and for game 2 it can be like any of these extra stages. And I really do think that that one in particular is a big holdover from Brawl, because again, we were trying to play with like Rainbow Cruise and Brinstar and stuff, and I think people just didn't want to potentially go there game 1. Yeah. So that one's definitely, if nothing else, a holdover from Brawl. And Melee does still like separate starters and counterpicks, but that's because they have an even number of stages, and you literally can't do striking with an odd number of stages. I obviously like can't look into an alternate timeline and say this with confidence, but I'm sure that if Melee had 7 good stages, by now they probably would have gone all starters and no separation into counterpicks. So that I also totally agree with you on. As for the accessibility thing, that is somewhere that I agree with you conceptually, but I don't really see DSR as a huge barrier to accessibility. And if it is actually my secret hot take that I've had for a while is, if we want to just like abolish DSR entirely, an alternative that we could do that pretty much accomplishes the same thing but in a slightly different way is just running no stage twice. I think that no stage twice, you could put like NST no stage twice on a rule set paper.
Okay.
That pretty much gets the exact same point across. It shouldn't make a difference most of the time. All it does is like, if you, let's say you lose game 1 on PS2 or whatever, and you want to just run it back, your opponent can actually say no. They're like, nope, no stage twice. We would have to gentleman there, and I don't want to go back, even though they just won there. So that is like the one thing that it would kind of change, is it prevents you from doing a salty run back to pretty much the game 1 of the set, which I think is honestly, it's interesting, because I think that the salty run back after game 1 is like a sort of important thing mentally for a lot of players, where they're like, okay, I just lost game 1, but I really think that I should have won. If I win game 2 on the exact same stage, that like really swings the like mental momentum back in my favor, because now they think, oh, was game 1 just a fluke? And then they start questioning like the decisions and stuff, blah, blah, blah. So that is where no stage twice would be like functionally quite a bit different from DSR, but in almost every other situation, in like a regular set progression of like counterpick, 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 it should work out pretty much the same. So for accessibility, if you really want to like sacrifice a tiny bit of competitive integrity for a little bit more accessibility, obviously your stance is get rid of stage clause entirely, and my stance would be, if we do think that DSR is like too confusing for new players or might potentially cause some friction with like them sticking in the scene, I think no stage twice is like a really, really simple, easy to communicate alternative.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I've never thought of like an alternative stage clause, right? So you're essentially pitching another stage clause.
Yeah, I mean, I actually pitched it to like the BC rule set panel when we were like doing our stuff and like taking in community feedback for a while. And I think it was kind of like just turned down for being a little bit too different than what anyone has ever done. And I don't even disagree because I do think that like the salty run back is kind of like it from a purely like if everyone was just a computer perspective, it wouldn't matter at all. But I know that people are people and they have emotions, and that like salty run back after losing game one truly is like an important part of the culture of Smash. So as much as I like No Stage Twice on paper, I understand that it's hard enough for me to like pitch a rule set that in this day and age when people are kind of having like anti DSR sentiments, it's kind of hard for me to say, hey, I like DSR so much that I want to go even further and go no stage twice. So that's sort of a concession that I was making when like I was kind of trying to design the rule set, where I'm like, all right, I already know that my ideas aren't like super popular with the community as a whole, and I think that that is also sort of, in my opinion, a little bit of misinformation because I do think that much like the people who I was talking to, where they're like, "Oh, I love DSR so much," or yeah, I love DSR so much, and people who don't run DSR are stupid, but then they can't really articulate why. I do think that there are definitely people on the other side as well who are like, "Oh man, I hate DSR so much," but they also can't really articulate why. So I think that's why it's really important to have these sorts of discussions where we are like actually explaining like the reasons and the rationale why we think that these things are important, so that people can like have a informed decision instead of just going with what their favorite top player told them their opinion should be.
Right, having an opinion for yourself, right? And I mean, no matter what level you compete at, like we want general feedback from everyone, and we also want discussion, and we want educated discussion. Not,
Mhm.
oh well, Tweak said X or Leo said Y, and that's what I think. And there's no explanation behind it either, right? So I definitely agree with you there. I'd love more like educated discussions about it because right now we're in the point of Smash where if you guys don't know the history of Smash, it started blowing up as a esports in Smash 4. So Brawl, like Apex was the biggest tournament. There's like what, maybe 200-300 people competing for a couple $100. So you're back in the Brawl days. It really, and I kind of miss this. I mean, it's just like you can't have grassroots and like big time esports at the same time, right? You can have it a little mixed here and there, but it's Brawl was the extreme of grassroots where we had no sponsors, nothing like that, and people just loved the game and we wanted to see who was the best at it. Did a lot of people play it? Not really, but it was still really sick. And I thought, the storylines back then and the playing with the community was really fun back then, right? Smash 4 was a transition period. So Smash 4 was like, okay, we're grassroots, and then especially around like the 2GG era of like the circuits and stuff and esports arena, that's when I was like, oh, what the fuck? I'm seeing like Smash players get on stage. I'm seeing like all these like esports brandings, like Gushers sponsoring this event. What the fuck? Like, you know what I mean? All these big time sponsors from these big companies started coming in to Smash. So I think the big thing that we're asking ourselves right now when we're trying to come up with these rule sets, one, we have a lot of options. Two, what rule sets are rule sets right now because it's legacy, and what rule sets are rule sets because they make sense. I think that's like the main topic we're trying to hinge, right? So it's like counter stages. I like how you brought up Brawl in that sense because we had some pretty fucking wild stages. Of course, I don't want to go to Brinstar game one. I mean, obviously, again, my striking point is like, well, it's on you to kind of like strike that, right? But again, the stages were like way crazier back then, and now like going to FD or Kalos is pretty risky in my opinion. Those are like Kalos is a very defensive loaded stage, right? Where it's like if someone gets the lead, there's a lot of defensive options, even like the wall, so you can like survive off stage interactions and stuff like that. It's a very defensive stage, whereas Final Destination can be also a very crazy offensive stage where it's like you don't really have options and disadvantage because there's no platforms to like air dodge to or land onto to reset your resources and stuff like that. So it can get pretty snowbally in that sense, right? So, I mean, not as crazy as something like Brinstar or anything like that. Like it's still a pretty reasonable stage, but there's just offensive or defensive advantages or disadvantages. So it always for me it's interesting kind of discussing like what do you think is a rule set because it's been around for so long, or what is a rule set because it just makes sense. And I think that's like the main thing we're trying to figure out. And even for me, we can even talk about this, how important you think it is to be unified, because I also think that's like a newer thing where it's like do we need to be unified? Should we even be unified? Like I think having a unified rule set helps in terms of rankings specifically. If we didn't really have rankings that affected people's like living or salary, then I wouldn't really mind, right? It's like, okay, well, each region kind of like plays however. If you go to that region, you play on their rule set, right? Like it's kind of like playing in home court, right? For regular sports and stuff like that. But because I will say the rule set, it does affect the outcome of a match, but I wouldn't say it affects the outcome of a match comparatively to like banning the best character in the game, like Steve,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, obviously, we're not going to get into that. It's a whole nother topic, but that's a very drastic rule set change where if you put the 100 best players in a tournament and you took away and banned the best character, the result becomes very, very different, right? As to where a rule set, you put the 100 best characters and you play on a PNW rule set, or if you play on East Coast Collision rule set, it might be a little different, but I would assume it's like everything would be generally like close to the same, right?
Yeah, like the change would kind of just be like, is game two going to be on Smashville or Hollow Bastion? Like that's really the scope of like what we're discussing here. It's just these like two extra stages, more or less, in like a regular best of five. You would either have like one more stage that's slightly more favored to one player and one more stage that's slightly more favored to the other player. And then realistically, if you're doing like the same number of bans, it means that games 4 and 5 are probably going to be the same anyway. Yeah, so I'm kind of with you where like the ranking is the one thing that makes me think we probably should have a unified rule set at least in like each continent, because that's where the bulk of people would travel like within their continent. But if you want to go like outside of the continent, you're either like a really top player who basically has to do it for their living, or you just wanted to take a vacation, which is also totally fine. I think that the Pacific Northwest rule set is a little bit of an interesting historical case, because I think that being so isolated from the rest of the country, like geographically Pacific Northwest, even though it's obviously like connected to the rest of the continent, there's like a big swath of like very few people living in the area that kind of surrounds the Pacific Northwest. So it's like you have to go quite a while south to get to California, and you would have to go like super far to get to the East Coast, right? So historically, I think that the region has kind of always felt like they're a little bit neglected or kind of like
On an
bullied.
island.
Yeah, exactly. It's like people are like, I mean, obviously you're from Hawaii, if I understand right. So
Yeah,
like you are actually from like an island,
yeah.
but Pacific Northwest sort of has that syndrome where they're like, oh man, all these other regions are like trying to force their rule sets on us. We just want to run the things the way that we want to run them. So that's why in the Lumi Rank Discord, I was kind of saying like, hey, I understand that like a lot of the country continent feels like pretty strongly about no DSR, but like Pacific Northwest, I don't think that the players would be very receptive to kind of Lumi Rank just coming in and saying, "Hey, you're running no DSR now, otherwise your events don't count." So that's why I think it's like pretty difficult to enforce that. And again, it really is just going to come down to like, is game two on like Smashville or Hollow Bastion? Like that's the big extent. So I don't think that there are like 20%, definitely not even like 20% of sets would be different on like one rule set or another. It's probably like closer to 1%, if that, amongst like top level players, where it's like, oh, if I have to play on the Pacific Northwest rule set, maybe I would like lose game two in a situation where I wouldn't have normally lost game two, and then that puts me on the back foot, and then blah blah blah, something. Now it's a completely different set. That could happen, but again, I think that it's like such a very slim minority of situations where that would occur. So we are really like arguing over like the tiniest of margins here. So I don't think that for Lumi Rank they have to really enforce that everyone has the exact same rule set. I actually think, even though I've historically been like opposed to people saying stage list when they mean rule set, because like I do feel obviously strongly about DSR, so I'm like, okay, if you're going to talk about a tournament stage list, but you actually mean the rule set, just say the word rule set. But I think that stage list as like a subset of a rule set, that is something that I think that North America could totally unify on, because I think that we're like mostly almost there. It truly is just a couple of regions still have Kalos legal, from what I understand, because I think that Yoshi's is like, unless I'm completely missing a couple of regions, I think it's almost entirely gone from like every single rule set that I see
In North America.
Yeah, in North America. I know that it's still in Europe, and then I guess any rule sets in North America that use the European stage list would probably include Yoshi's. But yeah, I think that it would definitely be a much more reasonable goal to say, okay, this is the North American stage list. you can have like different numbers of bans and different numbers of stage claws and blah blah blah. You can run no stage twice or whatever, and that is probably not going to affect things nearly as much as having like entirely different stages legal. Because even if you are thinking to yourself, "Oh, I'm just like always going to ban Kalos and Yoshi's because I don't really know how to play on them," that could open you up to like having like other stages picked against you. Or if you think, "Okay, maybe I'll just leave it open and assume that they won't pick it," but then they do pick it. Even if your character might like technically be kind of good on that stage, you're put in a situation where you might be not quite as practiced. So I think that just like having a different set of stages legal forces you to practice in a different way, as opposed to just like having a different stage clause. Again, I have like the crux of my argument has kind of been that like having DSR requires you to practice on more stages, and I think that that is a good thing. But unless I'm like really misunderstanding the way that top players practice, I think that most of them would kind of just like put all of the stages that are legal for whatever tournament they're going to on random, and then just like play a bunch of random map sessions with whoever they're practicing with. And so you're probably going to get like a decent amount of practice on each stage. I do think that at the top level there is like room for that like really micro optimization of, okay, like I'm playing Pikachu now, and I'm gonna learn how to do like all of the really optimized combos on small battlefield and battlefield, so that I can like ban this stage against this character, so that if they do take me to battlefield, I'm not just like a fish out of water. And being able to actually do that, as opposed to if you have no DSR and then you have an extra ban, then you can kind of like ban the one stage and also the battlefield stages. So I think that it does require you to practice a little bit differently, but not so much that it's going to affect a whole ton of the ranking.
Yeah, and it gives you more. It can reward players for being more studied on specific maps and stuff like that. Yeah, for sure, I agree on that. And one thing I do want to mention as well, in terms of just like the general process, like we're trying to be pretty transparent when it comes down to the process of it. I think even the idea of a unified stage list is great. Like say the and by the way, so for the Lumi ranking with all the TOs coming together for the rule set, the Lumi rank will not be enforcing like if you don't play on this rule set, you are not ranked. Because obviously the Lumi rank, there's a power dynamic that comes into this, which is why the Lumi rank is being very careful, right? Because if you like control the ranking, right, and you try to force certain things, that's where it can be like, oh wow, now you're being like
Bad guy.
right, or you're trying to manipulate X and Y for Z, right, or some shit like that. Like there's a lot of things that can go wrong. I do think the character ban thing is has to be addressed, because it like there has to be like there has to be at least some kind of rule. Like even if it's like something for me, I don't really agree with it, but if it ended up being like, well, you can ban any character at your tournament and it just counts 100% towards this ranking, if that's how it ends up being, like that, it is what it is. But at least we know like this is the standard, right? This is the standard. And you know, even if Lumi rank was like, oh yeah, we decided this because we want to give TOs the power to do X, Y, and Z, and they're the ones putting, you know, the TOs are the ones that are putting the most risk down, right? A lot of these TOs, sometimes they have to go, I would say most of the time, if not all the time, their very first tournament, they go negative, then maybe get it to the point where it makes money and stuff like that. And they're also providing jobs to a bunch of other people in the community, like commentators, like players. Like obviously players wouldn't really have a job if there was no tournaments and stuff like that. So kind of giving this decision to the TOs, I agree with, you know what I mean? So and then for the Lumi ranking, again, they're not going to enforce the rule set in a sense where it's like, oh, if you don't run this rule set, you don't count, right? The NA unified rule set, the one we're working on, the thing we're calling it is the NA suggested unified rule list, right? So just very loosely being like, hey, this is something we suggest. If you're starting up a tournament, you don't know where to start, fuck it, go with this. If not, you can kind of maybe alter some of these things or maybe go with something completely different. But I don't think we want to come in and just be like, oh, we are forcing this rule set, and we definitely want to do that, because that's just not how Smash has operated, right, for this past entire time. And even if PNW took like say the NA, like hypothetical, right, NA unified rule list comes out, and say the stage list ends up being 7 and or even 8 or whatever have you, right? Some state like PNW takes the stage list and they're like, we're going to play NA unified rule set, but instead of X bans, we do one less ban with DSR, right? Because I think, and just for the viewers at home, whenever you're kind of, because we didn't go into too much, we went into the actual stage count, right? But depending on the amount of stages you have on your stage list will kind of determine how much bans / DSR, right? And I think it's not completely universal, because in a best of 5, DSR can end up taking away, well, possibly taking away two stages, right? If someone goes up 2-0 and they did it on the same stage or something, like there's some possibilities where DSR only gets rid of one stage, if I'm not mistaken, or is it always guaranteed two because of how DSR works?
Ooh, well,
If it goes
for
to
the
game five,
person, yeah, so if it goes to game five, then you'll have one person who's already won two games. Most likely they won on whatever stage was struck to game one, and then they won on their own counter pick, which was probably game three or something, right? So usually they'll just get their like second best counter pick as their last game. So that is a situation where there can be two, but there could also be situations where only one stage is blocked. Like if they win game one on PS2 and then the
they
other
run it
player
back.
is like, man, I want to run it back, and then player one wins
I
game one
see.
on PS2 again, and then they like lose the next two games, then they could only have one stage blocked off. But in general, yes, it's either going to be like in a best of three, whoever wins game one is only going to have one stage that's blocked off by DSR. In a best of five, there could be situations where either one or two stages are blocked off. So that's kind of how that ties into ban count. Obviously, if there are like seven stages and you have two bans and full DSR, you can get put in a situation where you have to counterpick the stages that you were previously banning on your ban phase. So that's why we dropped the ban count by one to avoid those situations where
Right.
whoever actually wins game one is sort of at a disadvantage. Like you're still not technically at a disadvantage because winning game one, it's still like conditional probability, even if you assume like 50-50 win on every game. Once you win game one, you're still very favored to win the set. But it
Right.
just makes weird situations where you're not as favored as you kind of should be.
But we can agree that DSR generally you can count it as a ban, right? Like it's pretty interchangeable in that sense,
Yeah.
right? It's not
Yeah.
exactly one ban, but it's pretty damn close to being like one ban.
It is a restriction on what the opponent can pick as their stage. But again, that's also another reason why I kind of like no stage twice as an alternative, because just mentally it doesn't feel like, oh, this stage is banned for me only, and it's like I'm wasting my ban on this stage that I didn't actually really want to ban. It truly does just feel like, okay, this stage is no longer allowed for anyone to play the entire set. So now like my mental list of stages that are allowable is like now only six stages instead of seven stages. So obviously, like again, I've kind of gone into how it's like not really different from DSR most of the time, but it does feel different where you might not feel like, oh, I'm just wasting a ban that I don't want to waste. It is just like this stage is no longer part of the list, and now I just only focus on these six.
Yeah, and I think even the stage clause, no stage twice, you could make a gentleman rule, right? Where it's like if
Yeah.
someone's like run it back, and then the other guy's like,
And then the person,
yeah, sure,
yep.
yeah, and then you run it
Yeah.
back, right?
I think it sort of runs into funny mind games where someone says run it back, and then the other person is just like, you want that salty run back, so I'm gonna say no.
Yeah, they're
Which
just like, fuck you.
again, exactly, like it's kind of it takes what used to be like the salty run back cultural significant thing and sort of flips it on its head, where now you have to basically be like granted permission to do the salty run back, and the other person can deny it, which might actually just like make you spiral even more. Or let's say you get the salty run back that you wanted, but then you lose that game, then it's like, man, he allowed that to happen and I still lost. So
Right,
like
right.
I think that it might sort of remove like what used to be a cultural staple in the Smash community, but it can change it into something that could be like just as good, if not better. Which is why I'm like low key. I would love No Stage Twice to be at least given a shot, but I understand that that's like very radical for a lot of people.
Yeah, and even for me, when I think about the NA suggested unified rule set, even if it's something like, okay, well, when you go into PNW, they have one less ban, but they have DSR. They have full DSR, right? Because another thing I don't like about DSR, and we kind of went over this earlier, is I hate how, like, apparently there's a third version of DSR that I don't even fucking know what that is.
I can explain that one.
Oh, go
That's
for it.
TSR. Yeah, so
TSR.
that is you can't go back to the last stage that you counterpicked and won on. And so it's interesting because like
Gets rid of
in a
game
best
one.
of three, it doesn't apply to game one because you didn't counterpick to that stage. So it also wouldn't apply to if you win on your opponent's counterpick. You can still, if for whatever reason you wanted to go there again, you could do that. But TSR, I think, was like sort of floated around during Smash 4. And I even remember, I think that BC ran it for a little bit, but ultimately it just makes it's kind of just like no DSR in a best of three because there will never be a stage that you counterpick to and one on in a best of three. So it's effectively the same as running no DSR in a best of three. And in a best of five, the situations where it's actually like any functionally different than DSR are like so few and far between that I think that one, it's just simpler to have DSR, and two, the situations where you want to stop someone from like going back to game one, because let's say that it's two players and they might not know each other that well, and they strike, and one person realizes after they struck stages, wow, this like PS2 was actually not a neutral stage at all. Like, let's say you're playing against Mario and you think, yeah, let's just go PS2, and then the Mario like ladders you 3 times because he's insane on that stage. Then you're like, wow, I just struck to that, and now I lost the game there. And because we're using TSR instead of DSR, I now have to like use my extra ban, even though like TSR might like give you less bans just because that's the way the rule set's written. So you really feel like you get double punished for striking wrong. And that's another thing that I kind of like about DSR is it evens out striking incorrectly for like game one, because if you do strike incorrectly on game one and you get to a stage that's like pretty advantage for your opponent, or like you didn't know that they could do all these things on the stage, like Sheik actually has some kind of messed up stuff on PS2, like and I don't think that a lot of people know that. So sometimes when I go there, I'm like, oh cool, I won there, and they let me go there. And if we were running no DSR, then like in the next game they would probably really want to strike PS2, which sort of like double punishes them for not striking correctly on game one. Whereas DSR, it's like, okay, I still have to win on 3 stages anyway. Now one of them has been PS2, so I just need to figure out which other 2 stages I can win on. And the opponent's like, okay, maybe I lost on PS2, but that's okay because they still have to win on 3 stages. So as long as like there's only like one other stage that they can win on, I can still bring this back.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's another thing too, and I'm not gonna use the other forms of DSR to put down regular DSR. I think the other forms of DSR were brought on during, especially Smash 4, because of the limited amount of stages we had. Because we tried to have a big stage list, but then we ran into Duck Hunt, we ran into Lilat, and we were like, oh wow, like these kind of suck ass, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, and with DSR, I think again, I with how the unified suggested rule set for NA when it does come out, like even for me, I honestly kind of don't care what, or I do care, obviously, like I do care what the rule set ends up being, but as long as majority of the TOs go, even if it's completely opposite of what I feel the rule set should be, that's completely fine for me, right? As long as like we get majority of the TOs who are the backbone of the community, right? So I really want to point that out. The TOs are the backbone of the community. We should definitely hold, like they should be the ones deciding this kind of stuff, right? And then, you know, say it goes into the favor of DSR, right? And then Tri-State can take that modified rule set, take away DSR and just put one more ban, right? One thing I do like about DSR is it's very flexible in a sense where it's like, since DSR can pretty much be substituted with a ban, or you can take a ban away and insert DSR. That's one thing I like, because even if that is a very big like split amongst the community, like you said, as long as the players know what stages they are going to play on, I think that is the main thing that top players are going to be concerned about. Like, do I have to know how to fucking play on Yoshi's or not? Do I have to know how to play on Kalos or not, right? Like, these are controversial stages that some regions have, some regions don't. I know Japan has completely gotten rid of Kalos, and then Europe is playing on Yoshi's, and then North America plays on Kalos but not on Yoshi's. You see how like these big regions play on such different stages, right? And I mean, if I think in terms of a rule set, the stage is like the actual stage list is probably the most impactful in the rule set. You can adjust the timer and stock, obviously, like the actual rules in the game. Like timer and stock would affect more, right? Like you literally affect the pacing of the game with timer. With stocks, you obviously affect how much lives each player has and stuff like that. But outside of those very obvious things, the stage list is probably the next most impactful thing. And I think as long as we can unify on an actual stage list, and then from that unified stage list, regions can be like, oh, okay, like we like DSR, we don't like DSR. I think that's the one thing that's great about it, is that it feels pretty versatile in that sense.
Yeah, I will say one thing that like does I mostly agree with that. The one tiny hangup that I have is in rule sets with no DSR and more bans. I think that it's more reasonable to have those kind of wild stages like Kalos or Yoshi's that can be like a little bit swingy, but you have more bans to get rid of them. In a full DSR rule set, or even a no stage twice rule set, I think that it's a bit of a tougher sell, because if you have like, let's say, an 8-stage list and only one ban, and you have both FD and Kalos, I think that the person who might not be as good on those stages, might not be as practiced, or might just play a bad matchup on those stages, they are, I think, disproportionately punished compared to the other player who maybe their second worst stage is only like Hollow Bastion or something, where it's like a much more tame thing than the FD or Kalos that one player is going to have to go to. So in that sense, I don't think that it's like truly interchangeable if we are thinking about competitive integrity here, which was it was sort of the point that I kind of alluded to like right at the start of our discussion where I said we're saying that these 7 or 8 or 9 stages are the like competitively viable stages, and if you want to be a competitor you need to know how to play on all of them. And I think that with like more bans, no DSR, you can get away with like not really learning how to play on a couple of them, either because of like character or even just preference, where you're just like, I'm just going to ban like Kalos literally every single set that I ever play, so I'm never going to have to learn how to play on it. In a less bans with DSR situation, that's not quite as viable, and so that's why I'm like kind of against Kalos and Yoshi's as a whole, because I do think that they are truly like unfit for competition. And I know that that wasn't why we had this conversation in the first place. It was more about stage clause, but
No, but I think we're getting to the part of the conversation where we can
yeah.
bridge into that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that those stages, and I'm sure there are many people who agree and disagree with me, are just like they shouldn't even be in the picture. It's not just like, oh, okay, well, we have both of them and they balance out because like the Marios are always going to ban the Kaloses and the I don't know, the Kazuya's are going to ban the Yoshis, and that just like always makes things even out. And I don't think that that's like quite as true in a situation with no DSR, because I think that like the second best stage thing, it really does skew matches a little bit more to who has the like more powerful second best stage. And I do think again, like a stage is a tool. I think that knowing how to play on all the stages are important, but Kalos in particular, I think is just a very uninteractive stage for a lot of matchups where like if you want to play in the least skillful way possible, you can be rewarded for it. And I've done that in the past. Like a lot of North America tournaments that I've traveled to, they've had Kalos legal, and a lot of the time if I'm playing
stage, man, holy shit, and a Sheik stage too.
yeah,
Like,
no. I think it's an even better Sheik stage. I don't really play Pikachu much anymore.
Right.
But like, I think that against any character with like low mobility, I can just like go to one platform, throw some needles down towards them, they get close to me, double jump, bouncing fish to the other side, and then just repeat. And I think that that is like the lowest skill way possible to win a game. And I've done this in tournament before to like pretty good players. So in that sense, and again, this is definitely colored by the fact that I do play Sheik, which is like maybe one of like 5 or 6 characters that can like really pull that off effectively. I just don't think that Kalos is fit for competition, because I do think that winning on Kalos, if you're using a strategy like that, is just like less skillful, and I don't think that it should count equally as like winning on like small battlefield or something that the players actually have to like interact.
Yeah, I agree. And even I think one stage that we can compare Kalos to and some of the previous games is Duck Hunt. I made Fox in Smash 4, and I've won games and sets going Sheik on Duck Hunt and needle camping and bouncing fishing between the 2 trees, one on the left side that was very high, and then one on the right side. And I think in terms of Kalos, the way I like to break down the stage is that it's very defensive. So whoever gets the lead is at a very high disadvantage, or whichever character has the highest mobility, because it's very large. Plus it has large blast zones. Plus it has a wall. Plus it's just large. It's just a big stage. Plus it has platforms. And I think this topic is the topic that needs to get discussed about the most when we talk about stages, because it goes back to some of the previous iterations of Smash, is any platform, and this is something that Fallen actually brought up to me in our discussion, is any platform that does not have stage underneath the platform. And I'm talking the whole platform, because whenever you look at like hazards on, I mean, we didn't have any choice, but Smash 4, Smashville is a stage that has a moving platform that goes off the stage for X amount of time, then it gets back on the stage, right? And if your character can stall and run away when the platform's on the stage and get to the platform again when it goes off the stage, you are now effectively punishing someone for having a character that doesn't have the speed or the mobility to pressure you, right? And not all characters have a Cloud back air, right? Like Kalos for Cloud is whatever, because you know he has a fucking sword that's the size of the damn platform, right? Not every character has that luxury. So, and not every character can catch a Sheik double jump from one platform, bouncing fish to the other platform. Not a lot of characters can catch Sheik doing that. Some characters can, and they're very good, but not a lot of characters can do that. So it promotes this like circle camping strategy, and I just want to get rid of this whole fucking like, why are we allowing hyper defensive stages? Like, I don't think that promotes skill expression. It's just, oh, my character has this and your character doesn't. Hold that shit. Like, I win.
Yeah.
Why are we that is And now we talked about skill expression. That was like the main topic from the beginning. So this is already something that me and Captain L agree with in terms of like what skills do you need to win on X stages, and I think that's something to be thought about. And I think there's like these little niche rules that we can kind of apply, right? That we've already applied to the past. When it comes, do we have walk-off stages that are legal? No. Should we, like slants and walls and platforms that don't have stage under them? I think those are the three controversial ones. Some that are already locked in, like side-scrolling stages, gone. Walk-off stages, gone. Right? Stages with ridiculously small blast zones, gone. That's a little bit more on the in between. Like some people argue WarioWare should be legal and stuff, but like I think for the most part, most of the community is not down with extremely small blast zones because the game is not prolonged; it's shortened, right? So there's less interactions. So stuff like that, and I think Kalos is definitely one of those stages that is just promotes defensive play in almost every single aspect of the stage, which is ridiculous. And then Yoshi's is, which is crazy. I hate Yoshi's, but I think Yoshi's is more justifiable than Kalos. And I don't think I think neither of them should be legal, but I I agree with Captain L of the whole. I hate the whole argument of like, oh well, we can have this stage because we have this much bans. Like, oh, we have these band-aids that we can patch on these bad stages. Like, why the fuck do we have these bad stages in the first place? Like, I don't know. I'm that really frustrates me. And so I have a question for you. What is the amount of stages that you think is the most versatile if we were to have like at least a unified stage list in North America where you can kind of like, oh, sub out X band or like sub out one band for a DSR? Like, do you think 7's the sweet spot? Like, because I feel like 7 is that sweet spot, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think 7 is the sweet spot, and I think most people know what the 7 stages are. It's like the 2 battlefields, FD, Smashville Town, PS2, and Hollow Bastion. There's still a little bit of debate where some people are like, oh, Hollow Bastion and Smashville, those are like way too similar. And there are also people who I understand are like, wow, FD, that stage just like really sucks. It's like way too polarizing in certain matchups. So why do we allow it? So I think that 7 is probably what you're going to get the most buy-in for. If that doesn't work, I would actually prefer 5 because I just
7, yeah.
Yeah, five or 7, and I think that it has to be an odd number because then you can still do fullest stage striking, which I agree with you. I think that's both from an accessibility standpoint and just like from a competitive integrity standpoint. I think that it just makes more sense to do fullest striking. So 5 or 7 are really our two options. As for which of the 7-ish stages,
or 9 if you're Europe, and you can throw in Kalos and Yoshi's.
Or 9 if you're Europe. Okay, actually, just tiny tangent for my hot take of the year. I think that Lilat is a better stage than Kalos, and that speaks mostly to how bad I think that Kalos is, but also partially because they truly did fix a lot of the issues with Lilat and Smash 4. I would never actually argue for it in like a universally adopted rule set because I do think that we have better stages to go for, but the fact that Kalos has stuck to the rule set longer than Lilat, I actually think is a little bit surprising and not the way that I think it should have gone. My other hot take is, and this isn't even a hot take. This is just me trying to like correct what I think I see people saying on Twitter. A lot of people are like, "Oh, we need to have like Kalos and Yoshi's because the walls are like create depth in like different situations." And I'm like, no, the walls take away depth. They literally, objectively take away depth. You never have to like worry about recovering against a character with a spike. You always just go straight to the wall, ride the wall up, and when they spike you, you tech it. It just like takes away mix-ups. It does not add anything different.
Some characters have OSs to cover that. Some, but like Bouncing Fish is one of them, right? And there's I think Sonic has one where he like he does the spin dash in, and they tech wall jump. He can like jump back air and stuff like that. But then there's mix of like, are you gonna tech wall jump, directional air dodge to ledge? Are you gonna tech no wall jump and then up B back up, right? Like you still have a lot of defensive options. And yes, I definitely agree with you on the wall standpoint. And I fucking hate Lilat so much because it's done me dirty so many times in Smash 4. But I do agree with you that Lilat is, I would say, like overall competitive wise, is better than Kalos. Yes. which is like pretty wild coming from me because if you know me and especially know me from Smash 4, I like hate Lylat so much.
Oh, same. I had hashtag ban Lylat as my username on Twitter for like so long because I was like, man, that stage in Smash 4 is so bad. Even from like vision accessibility standpoint, I think that it's like so hard to see some shit on that stage. Like especially against Snake, I don't like being forced to ban a stage just because like
Visual
the
shit.
characters' visuals blend in with the background. Like I think that that's very silly. So again, Lylat bad stage, Kalos worse, Yoshi's I would say about as bad as Lylat mentally. But again, I do want to stress that if I was going to a tournament that had these stages legal, I would practice on them. As a competitor, I will play to whatever rule set I need to go to. So I'm not saying, oh, I hate these stages because I never want to have to play on them. I'm saying that like from someone who's trying to design a rule set for competitive integrity, I think that they are unfit and they either cause like unintended degenerate strategies where like you can circle camp or you can like always recover in a certain way and it's way safer than it should be, or they like actually just have like straight up accessibility issues where like being able to see stage elements becomes an issue. So back to like how many stages should we have? I think it is 5 or 7. If you're going to go down to 5, I think that you remove FD for sure. Not because I actually think it's a bad stage. I truly do actually think that people give FD way too much hate, and a lot of people are like, oh, my character can literally just never win on FD, so I need to always ban it. I think that's just a skill issue, and I also think that the argument of like, oh, I never want to have to like fight against a Pocket Kazuya on FD, I think that's also a skill issue. If you're losing to someone secondary, they either had to like put in a lot of time to get a secondary because Kazuya is not exactly an easy character to play, or you're just like so much worse than them that even their like Pocket Kazuya is beating you on FD. So from like a getting buy-in from the community, I think FD would have to be one of the stages that goes, and then the other one is probably going to be either one of the Smashville Hollow Bastions or Town, because I know that there is like a decent amount of anti-Town sentiment, and I also think that it's like kind of warranted. But the problem is then if you get rid of FD and Town, then the people who like prefer that kind of archetype of stage where it's a lot more flat ground, they just feel like, oh, hold on, you just took away like my 2 best stages, and all like the Falcos and Marios of the world get to keep like all their platform stages. Like this doesn't feel very fair. So I think that even though 5 stages like might be nice, it would be really difficult to get buy-in from the community for it.
Yeah, and I do have a suggestion for a 5-stage list that feels like pretty even, but it kind of goes against my own philosophy of just like making things accessible. So I don't like to bring it up, but if I were, I do agree that 7's probably the best, and the 7 stages that we said would probably be the most interchangeable, right, and make the most sense. And we just get rid of Kalos, we get rid of Yoshi's, and I mean those are just generally controversial stages. And right now Japan's the strongest region, so even like adhering to, I want to adhere to every single region. Like I would like a global stage list. That would be sick if we eventually got to that point. Because Smash 4 we did get to that point. It would be really sick to have that. But if I were to go down to 5, I would actually do what we did in Smash 4 and group the double platforms and group the single platforms. I don't know if you feel like that's too drastic, where you can, like, I can ban single plats and then it effectively gets rid of both Smashville and Hollow Bastion, because there are differences, but at the end of the day, like, at least the platform layout is very similar. The size of the platform, the height of the platform, and I know like the blast zones and stuff are different, but I think we could also go towards that strategy where it's like, oh, okay, so there's 2 double platforms, but they're grouped. There's 2 single platforms, but they're grouped, and we still have FD, we still have Town. How do you feel about like grouping stages, or I guess like even the concept of grouping stages? Did you like it in Smash 4? Do you think it could be applicable here in Ultimate?
No, I didn't like it in Smash 4, and I don't think that it could be applicable here. I think that, especially PS2 and Small Battlefield, I think that those stages play out so differently, like in so many situations. Like the platforms are closer together, they're different sizes, they're different heights. Like you mentioned Fox up smash being able to like hit some platforms but not hit others. I have a very similar tool with Sheik's up tilt where it hits the Battlefield and Small Battlefield and Hollow Bastion platforms, but it doesn't hit PS2 or anything higher than that. And that's like really important for pressuring platforms, because I think if you like have to jump and use an aerial to pressure a platform, that's like so much more committal than literally just like clicking up tilt. And if they drop shield between the 2 hits, then you like still get advantage off of that. Up tilt also locks on platforms, but only on the 3 stages that I mentioned. So like I'm like super opposed to grouping stages. And the other biggest reason why is that kind of gets you down to 5 stages. Like it is still 7, like sort of, but it's effectively just like 5 with 2 stages hiding in the back. And then if you do that, you literally just can't run full DSR because, sorry, you can run full DSR, but then the grouping would not matter at all because you would have to run full DSR with 0 bans. Because otherwise, like if you ban out 2 stages and you only have 3 left, you literally can't play a 5-game set on that, right? So the grouping would come into play where like if you win on PS2, then you can no longer go back to PS2 or Small Battlefield. So it would still like matter, but it would both like I don't know if you remember Battle of BC4, but we ran 6 stages and 0 bans in a best of 5, and I still stand by that rule set is great, but it got a ton of backlash. There was a lot of people who were like, "Man, I can't believe you're giving me 0 bans with like Riddles and T here," and they both ended up placing. Yeah, they were both in top 8. I get it. My counterpoint to that is Kazuya played on FD like I think a total of 4 games and only won 2 of them, so it's not an auto win. He only won half the time there. But point is, I get it. It's never going to be popular to have 0 bans.
I think it's a drastic change because you're taking something away from competitors that they used to have, right? Modifying it is something different, right? Like, oh, okay, you only have 1 ban because, and then you justify it like, oh, I justify X with Y, right? And then it's hard to justify when you bring that number to 0 and you're like, okay, well, the justification is, you know, like we just have 6 stages or 5 stages, right? And so the justification's there, but the justification has to be just as, it has to feel as impactful as the impact from going 1 to 0, right? And that probably didn't match up, and it probably would take time for people to get used to it. But yeah, whenever you take something away from competitors or something like that, like I feel like that just feels like you're going to get more knee-jerk reactions, right?
Yeah, the justification is we're saying that these 5 or maybe 6 stages are like, these are the stages that if you want to be a competitor, you have to be able to win on. And so I think that a 5-game set going to all 5 stages, I think that is fine. It's competitive integrity. It's like we're saying if you want to be good, these are the stages you have to be good on, and pick at least 3 of them that you can win on. And so that to me, it makes like technical sense from like just designing a rule set.
Yeah.
It makes sense on paper. I fully understand that you throw that at someone who's never played it before and they're like, hold up, I just got off the plane and you're telling me I get 0 bans in a best of 5? Like, I get that it's unpopular, and if it was ever going to get to that, it would take like quite a while of transition period. Like Melee has gotten to that. They have 0 bans, and that took them like what, 15 years or something before they like finally settled on that from when Melee. Exactly. Maybe not actually 15, but like it was like quite a while before they finally realized, okay, we're going to do 0 bans in best of 5. There's only 6 stages, and they eventually obviously froze Pokemon Stadium, so they don't even really have 6 good stages. They have like 5.5 good stages. And even then, that's a bit of a compromise. People are going to look at Smash Ultimate, and especially because like, by virtue of being an older game, Melee also kind of has like an older player base. I think that there are a lot of younger players getting into Smash who maybe don't have like nearly as much like background knowledge to look back on, and so they're just saying like, oh man, Smash Ultimate has like 100 stages, why are we playing on literally 5 of them? Like I get that people would want to say, I think that there's at least 7 stages that are like good enough to play on, and I can get behind that, even if I think that a 5-stage 0 ban list could be good. I would rather have a stage list that like balances a lot of different factors, because like as you said, accessibility is important. Not alienating people, not making people like literally boycott tournaments. That's probably pretty important if you want to have a tournament series that like keeps running. So I think that all of these things have kind of landed me in the firm camp of there are 7 stages that we should play on, and if you want to win a set, you should be able to win on at least 3 of them, and you can have 1 ban.
Yeah, I agree. I'm definitely on the 7 boat. And it just feels like a really good in-between, and it also feels like, oh, if you don't run DSR, 2 bans. If your region wants DSR, 1 ban DSR. Easy peasy, and then the stage list is big enough that we don't even have to fuck with like, oh, we're doing MDSR, TDSR, like we get to throw all that fucking bullshit out the window, right? And it's just like, all right, this is the stage clause. It's called DSR and blah blah blah, right? So,
or just call it stage clause, or call it no stage choice if you want to run that. Be a real bold TO.
Yeah, I definitely like stage clause more as a name over DSR, because DSR is just like an acronym, and like the first question is like someone's gonna be like, "What's DSR?" And then you have to be like, the name doesn't really matter because it doesn't explain fucking anything. It's a horrible
Who's
name.
Dave?
Yeah, who the fuck is Dave? Like, why is this rule stupid? Like, you know what I'm saying? So it's like already I'm 100% with you. If we do end up going with DSR and our rule says, can we just change the fucking name to stage clause? Because Jesus Christ, DSR is such a bad
Mhm.
name for a stage clause. But yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. And then the only other counter argument, like we went 5, 7, or you can go the extreme with 9, right? And when you go with 9, you kind of use this mentality of like, which I don't agree with, and Captain L also doesn't agree with, but you kind of go with this like with this mentality of like, oh, we're giving them an extra ban, and it's like another band-aid, and you can like they'll players will never have to play on it. Which again, I just don't feel like it's too fair to the players, because then you promote the strategy of I always ban XYZ no matter what. And I don't know. It's like I guess you could argue that that's not that big of a deal, right? Like that's not a bad strategy, but I do think kind of zoning that down to 7 and just giving the stage of 7 to a player, and they're not like extremes, right? Like look at these 7 stages. The most extreme one is maybe like what, Town or FD. Those are like
It's
probably the most extreme, and then those don't feel like as extreme as Kalos or Yoshi. So you're not going to get that knee jerk of like, what the fuck you run Yoshi's or what the fuck you run Kalos, right? So I think 7's the perfect in between. So I definitely
mhm.
agree with that. And that's pretty much all the thoughts I've had. We've been going on for about an hour 15. Do you have any closing thoughts, Captain L, before we close this one out?
Uh, just a meme that I love. People have kind of said in the past that there is only one objective rule set. The one rule set that Smash Ultimate actually gives us is 3 stages, and that's Battlefield, Small Battlefield, and FD, because that's what Elite Smash allows you to pick. So if we're trying to say, oh, the game doesn't tell us how to play, the game sort of does tell us how to play. It says these are the stages that are good. I would never seriously suggest that, but that's pretty much the only objective argument that can really be given for how the game tries to tell us how to play.
Japan has ran a stage list or rule sets with the stage list of 3 stages. So that has been done before in Japan. Would I be opposed to it? You said small battlefield, and FD, right?
FD. I mean, if you
Ooh,
run that with one ban, I think that literally just becomes a small Battlefield simulator, because I think that there's so many matchups where like Battlefield and FD tend to be like 2 of the more polarizing stages. I just don't see like very many situations at all where you go to anywhere besides small Battlefield. So I think it's a funny rule set, and maybe like in the early Wild West days of Ultimate, it could have worked if small Battlefield was even a stage in the game at that point in time, which it wasn't. But in modern day, especially with people like coming into tournaments with their expectations, and also probably with a lot of practice on a lot of these stages, I don't want to just say, hey, all that practice that you've done on
until
like
nothing.
Town and Smashville and Hollow Bastion, that doesn't matter at all. I'm fine with saying all the practice you've done on Kalos and Yoshi counts for nothing, because I think that those stages are a little bit degenerate, and they do promote strategies that aren't actually competitive
Or fun to watch. So I mean,
or fun.
like, oh,
Okay, actually, hold up.
you're hitting both sides, right? Like,
Yoshi's can be a little bit funny to
oh
watch
yeah, sure,
in a bit
Yoshi's
of a
can.
sadistic sense.
Yes, Yoshi's can be a little messed up, but
Oh, he just died to Mithra up air at 40. That's awesome.
yeah, that was cool. Imagine
Yeah.
WarioWare Mithra. Oof, that would
Dude,
be.
WarioWare Pikachu, that's the problem. You get hit by a back air
Oh yeah.
once and you are on stage, you are probably dead unless you have like really good SDI. And when you try to start telling the player base that they should just SDI, it brings up some bad memories.
Yeah, true. All right, well, that's going to be it for this discussion. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out Captain L on all of his socials. You wanted to shout out your socials real quick?
Captain El Chica on Twitter. I think I'm Captain El on YouTube, but I haven't uploaded a video since like 2019. It'll happen eventually. Probably, maybe Smash 6. Maybe I'll
Okay,
finally
okay.
release the secret tech that I've been holding on to for 2 years.
Ooh.
It's real, guys. It's not fake. I'm not making something up.
All right. Well, looking forward to that if that ever drops. But until next time, class dismissed.